hostages. The sexual offences and violations and rapes by Hamas also form part of these crimes against humanity that are being sought on arrest warrants for Hamas.
A business built around the image of Donald Trump that in reality is bleeding cash like it's a rare Trump steak, consumed by headlines of criminal misconduct tied to illegal backroom deals and flooded by a barrage of lawsuits. The presumptive Republican presidential nominee has had a long and sordid business career, and what we're witnessing with Truth Social harkens back to a specific chapter in that career, one more than 2 decades ago. As we speak, Trump's accountants warn the social media company is on borrowed time due to huge money problems, leading people who cover finance to say stuff like this.
And what you have is arguably the most hyped up, wildly trading new stock that we've seen in a heck of a long time.
Meanwhile, just today, a pair of big investors in the company pleaded guilty to insider trading, and Trump's own company is suing 2 of the co-founders, both former contestants on The Apprentice.
Andy, you're fired. Wes, you're fired also.
But flashback to the 90s and swap social media for the Atlantic City boardwalk, and you'll see some similarities. The headlines then were about Trump's casinos bleeding money.
In the past few months, it has seemed that the clock was always ticking for Donald Trump. This is deal after deal soured. The latest focus of attention, the mammoth Taj Mahal hotel and gambling casino in Atlantic City. It is big, it is glitzy, and it is in a financial hole.
The future president found himself consumed by lawsuits over everything from unpaid bills to his own bondholders upset over allegations of fraud, even over who owned the sign outside his Taj Mahal casino. And yes, there were also legal concerns about shady deals. Through it all, the IRS found one Trump casino broke anti-money laundering rules a whopping 106 times in its first year and a half of operation, while another casino admitted it broke the law when Trump's father bought $3.5 million in gaming chips he never planned to gamble and what amounted to an illegal de facto loan to his son. And just like he's doing with Truth Social, in the midst of it all, Trump headed to Wall Street to cash in.
Donald Trump is gambling. Investors want to bet on him again.
This is just the right time, and it's the right time for this industry.
The stock offering and a related junk bond deal are raising nearly $250 million.
And yet the lesson from Trump's time in Atlantic City is that for him, things turned out okay. As the New York Times notes, Trump put up little of his own money, shifted personal debts to the casinos, and collected millions of dollars in salary, bonuses, and other payments. And the burden of his failures fell on investors and others who had bet on his business acumen. The Times found that stock and bondholders lost more than $1.5 billion. So will the lessons from Truth Social be the same? I'm joined now by Dan Primack, business editor for Axios, who specializes in the kind of market manipulations that we are seeing around Truth Social. Dan, great to have you. We have the former president. He sells a lot of stuff these days. There's golden sneakers, Bibles. How do you see Truth Social as an offering?
I see it's kind of the stock version of the golden sneakers, right? It's not a very good company. Truth Social, for those who've never seen it, it is basically Twitter that's been reskinned. It's got basically the exact same functionality, nothing more, a little bit less. But most importantly, it doesn't have much of a business. Last year, it lost $58 million, which isn't that big a deal for a new company. The problem is it only made $4 million, and it made less money in the fourth quarter than it made in the third.
So, Trump is really good at screwing over other people before himself when his business dealings go south. Here, we saw Trump lose $1 billion on paper, at least in one day, though. So ultimately, I wonder if this venture tanks, would it actually have negative consequences for him?
Probably not. I mean, yes, he lost $1 billion in one day, which was earlier this week when the financials came out. But right now, he's up $3.8 billion from where he was basically 8 days ago. That's pretty good for him. I mean, if you think about this, his stake right now in Truth Social is worth $3.8 billion on a company that makes $4 million in revenue a year. It's a multiple. Somebody asked me the other day where it should be trading. I mean, less, like way less. You don't see this sort of multiple in any other company in any other industry.
I mean, Trump does have this long record of putting his name on things that already exist in the market, from steaks to vodka. And this current value aside, I know you kind of alluded to this, is there anything innovative about Truth Social, considering it does cater to a different audience? Or is it entirely just Twitter repackaged, even considering that?
It's Twitter repackaged for a MAGA audience. Now, there's a little bit of interesting stuff on the back end in the sense of one of their big things is they don't want to rely on big tech companies like Amazon or Microsoft, who are the ones who host most traditional tech platforms and apps. So they're trying to do it without those companies. But that's nothing that a consumer or a user would ever see. So no, there's not really. The only really innovative thing, and it's not innovative per se, is they've decided, despite being a public company, they are not going to collect or report basic user data to investors. How many downloads there have been, monthly active users, things like that, that whether it be Twitter or Meta or Snap or anybody else report regularly.
Here today you have these two investors in Trump Media in the insider trading case. They pleaded guilty after Trump was just found liable in the New York civil fraud case for grossly overvaluing his assets to get loans while undervaluing them for tax purposes. You go all the way back, as we mentioned, to his casino ventures and his hotel failing in Atlantic City at really the expense of so many hardworking people. How do you see all of these data points of questionable ethics and financial failures speaking to the kind of businessman that we now know Donald Trump to be?
I want to separate a little bit. These insider trading charges, and there was actually 3 charges. 2 guys pled guilty today. 1 more is going to fight this in court. These charges were first brought last summer, long before Truth Social went public. They are separate from Trump. In fact, they invested in this so-called blank check or SPAC that Truth Social merged with. It is notable, though, that when most companies, young tech companies, go public, they don't typically have a slew of lawsuits around them, even if it's not specific to the founder, to the CEO, or in this case, the majority shareholder, which Trump is. There's just this air of litigation which revolves around this. The 2 co-founders you showed there from The Apprentice, who aren't the insider trading guys, these are different. They sued Trump first, and now Trump is suing them back. There is litigation with the former CEO of the blank check company that has gone back and forth. So there's just an enormous amount of litigation. And honestly, in the end, Truth Social, when we look at its financials, it's probably going to spend as much on lawsuits as it is on anything else.
Yeah, we'll have to see how that math adds up. Dan, we know that you'll be on it when we see all the numbers. Dan Primack, thank you.
Thank you.
For anyone else, it would be dizzying. For Donald Trump, it is just Thursday. His attempt to get the classified documents case thrown out failed. His attempt to get the Georgia election interference case tossed on free speech grounds failed. And just yesterday, his motion to dismiss the New York hush money case against him failed. Now he's got a new hearing set in his business fraud case, and he's trying to push back on that barrage of bad news about Truth Social going public. I'm joined now by CNN political analyst and New York Times senior political correspondent Maggie Haberman. And Maggie, I know you have some new reporting tonight on the very issue that we were just discussing with Trump's former attorney, Jim Trusty. How do those who remain on his legal team view this issue of using the PRA, the Presidential Records Act, to claim the documents are personal?
Yeah, so Brianna, look, they were not surprised by the fact that this is the way that the judge ruled. They'll remember she has taken a very long time on ruling on a number of motions in this case. There's a huge backlog. It has sort of gummed up the works, and their strategy has been this blitz of filings to delay all of these trials. It's actually been pretty effective, and they're pretty open about the fact that they think it's been effective. She didn't totally close the door on the notion of the Presidential Records Act coming up at trial. And so because of that, you will continue to hear about this from Donald Trump, who has been saying this since it was put in his head in February of 2022. And I expect, again, this is going to continue publicly. Listen, they believed this was a long shot. They didn't think this was likely, but it was one of the many things they were going to try. And again, Judge Cannon has shown over and over again a willingness to be extremely open to the defense team's arguments.
I mean, what's really, as I said, a dizzying reality of trying to keep up with all of this. I mean, if you do, it's pretty difficult. You know that.
It's hard.
Donald Trump's, it's hard. His legal cases, everything that's going on. What are you hearing about which one he's particularly focused on?
Well, at the moment, he's really focused on the Manhattan trial. I asked him about this at his press conference at 40 Wall Street after the March 25th hearing, if he thought he could get an acquittal in this case. And he said, well, there shouldn't even be a trial. And I said, well, there is going to be a trial. And he was, trying to suggest that he's still relying on some kind of an appeal effort. I see no evidence that there is going to be a further delay, but they did get a delay of a couple of additional weeks, which they were very happy about. But that trial is where his focus is and where it is going to stay, because at the moment, it is on track to be the only trial that takes place before the election. And as you know, Brianna, their goal has been to push all of these cases past Election Day.
Yeah, his response to days of bad headlines about his social media company was to post, quote, "My TV ratings are by far the highest, and my rallies are not equaled, even close, anywhere by anyone." How hard is this for him to accept that Truth Social isn't, the Twitter killer or just a success of a sort in its own right that he'd hoped it would be?
I think we have seen him over and over again to refuse to accept external reality and to continue to try to paint things as he wants them to be seen, and this is one of those times. However, the objective reality is the fact that the stock tumbled earlier this week. What was initially adding to his net worth, at least on paper, by several billions, is no longer that. He is getting a lot of headlines around this, and he is just trying to will it into some kind of a different reality. I think, for most of his supporters, I don't think the fact that Truth Social is not doing well
Something very unusual is happening in Israel. Senior military officials have begun voicing criticism of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's conduct of the war in Gaza. Israeli media has been reporting on a weekend security meeting at which the Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, General Herzi Halevi, criticized Netanyahu's lack of a clear strategy, pointing out that the Israeli military had re-entered northern Gaza, an area it claimed to have cleared in January. He warned that unless there was a plan to set up some kind of non-Hamas government in these areas, the IDF would have to keep repeating these kinds of operations endlessly. Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, has gone further, publicly criticizing the prime minister, pointing out that the day after Hamas will only be achieved by actors who replace Hamas, and declaring that he would not permit Israel to try to govern Gaza directly. The New York Times reported on others within the Israeli military making similar criticisms. As Anshel Pfeffer writes in Haaretz, these briefings to the press have been synchronized as part as what can only be a coordinated briefing against the prime minister. The reason for these extraordinary dissents at a time of war is that Israeli officials have begun to realize what American officials have been warning them about for months, that without a strategy to create stable governance in Gaza, they will face a continuing insurgency, just as the U.S. did in Afghanistan and Iraq. There is evidence it is already happening. Israeli forces have been forced back into Jabalia twice, and they have returned 3 times to Zaytun. Their recent and controversial raid on the Al-Shifa hospital was the second effort, showing that their initial success was not lasting. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken noted last Sunday,
"We've seen in areas that Israel has cleared, in the north, even in Khan Yunis, Hamas coming back."
Much has been written about whether the Israeli military is being careful or callous in its concern for civilian casualties when conducting its attacks in Gaza. But the larger point has to do with its counterinsurgency strategy itself. In America's only successful counterinsurgency campaign in recent memory, the surge in Iraq, its strategy was designed to protect the civilian population, isolate the insurgents, and then crush them. To that end, General David Petraeus worked tirelessly with Iraq's Sunnis, the community spawning the insurgency, to win them over, give them a stake in Iraq's government, and thus isolate the insurgents and the militias. He then used lethal force against those militias. This is almost the inverse of Israel's strategy, which has been first and foremost to go after Hamas guns blazing, with very little regard for winning the hearts and minds of Gaza's civilian population. Prime Minister Netanyahu's argument against post-war plans and operations is that the war isn't over, and in his words, there is no alternative to military victory. The attempt to bypass it with this or that claim is simply detached from reality. Bibi has repeatedly said that he would continue the war until he achieves total victory, by which he presumably means either a surrender by Hamas or its total eradication. The Biden administration has from early on in the war believed that Bibi's strategy was flawed because there was no way to defeat Hamas militarily without a political strategy to isolate it and offer an alternative that had some credibility and legitimacy. That was why the Biden administration wanted to begin discussions with the Palestinian Authority and a group of Arab states like Egypt and Saudi Arabia to make plans for reconstruction and governance in a non-Hamas Gaza. Netanyahu has refused to consider any such plans. Bibi Netanyahu refuses to talk about the post-war because he knows that his own post-war future is bleak. Many Israelis continue to hold him responsible for the policies that led to the October 7th attack. Were new elections to be called, he would likely lose office and then face an ongoing prosecution as well as potential inquiries about the failures that led to October 7th. All of this can be pushed off as long as he insists on a Hamas surrender, which he will not get, but which will keep the war going on indefinitely. It is a strategy not designed to secure Israel's future, but rather his own. Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started.
So you heard what I had to say. What does a better war strategy for Israel look like? Joining me now is former CIA director and retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus, whom I mentioned in my take. He commanded American and coalition troops both in Iraq and Afghanistan. David, welcome. First, let me ask you to explain, what was the heart of your strategy in Iraq, which worked? You were battling an insurgency, a bunch of terrorists, militias, call them what you will, and the U.S. had not been able to really eradicate those terrorists. What did you do?
Well, first and foremost, we committed to making life better for innocent Iraqi civilians, and we pledged that we would get al-Qaeda, an extremist group irreconcilable, similar to Hamas, out of their midst. We would clear their neighborhoods, their cities of al-Qaeda, and then we would keep them out of those cities and neighborhoods, would create gated communities, 12 of them alone in Fallujah, which was already completely encircled by cement to keep them out. And then you have biometric ID cards. We would flood the area immediately with humanitarian assistance, then restore basic services, and then go about the comprehensive reconstruction, rebuilding all of the damaged infrastructure, restoring schools, markets, clinics, bridges, roads that had been blown up by al-Qaeda and by the other of the most dangerous Sunni insurgent groups. And then keep the pressure on those groups, constantly going after them after having cleared comprehensively from the populated areas. But the key was the hold and the build. We're seeing in Gaza the clearing. The problem is if you don't hold, again, keep the people separate from, in this case, Hamas, which is, again, an extremist group akin to the Islamic State. It's irreconcilable. But if you don't separate them from the population and keep them separate, you're going to have to go back and re-clear, because extremist groups, if they're not kept out, will reconstitute. We saw it ultimately at the end of the 3.5-year period after the surge, which drove violence down by nearly 90%, and it continued to go down even as we drew down in the subsequent 3.5 years until the withdrawal of our final combat forces and Prime Minister Maliki taking highly sectarian actions that took his security forces' eyes off the Islamic State They were able to reconstitute, and of course, within 2 years, you had the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. Look, I want to see Israel succeed. I believe Hamas does need to be destroyed. What they did on October 7th was absolutely barbaric and horrific and unspeakable. And it's an example that you've got to get them out of control of the people and out of the governance of Gaza. And obviously there has to be then some kind of vision for what the future will be. And of course, it's interesting to see the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, and then also the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces calling for the establishment of a vision for a midterm and then a longer term, because if you don't know where you're going, as they say, any road will take you there.
Iran State News is reporting Iranian officials now know the exact location of a helicopter that crashed with the country's president, Ibrahim Raisi, on board. Cold temperatures, fog, and nightfall have all made it challenging for search crews who have been at it now for 10 hours. For more now on this development, I'm joined now by CNN senior national security analyst Juliet Kayyem and John Alterman, director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East program. Good to see both of you. All right, John, you first. I mean, this seems to be a pretty sizable development, but the terrain is still going to be a challenge. What do we know about this area, how mountaineers, medics, search teams will be utilized?
It is pretty remote. It's all the way tucked into the upper left-hand corner of Iran near the Azerbaijan border. There aren't a lot of people. The whole province has about 50,000 people. So there's not a lot of infrastructure. There aren't a lot of people to help out. An advantage for the government is that means there aren't a lot of pesky eyes looking around. If they want to hold news in, they want to control the news, it's much easier in a place like this location than if it happened in a more populated area where it would be much harder to control the news.
And Juliet, our Oren Lieberman reported that the U.S. is monitoring the situation, but has to maintain a distance. What are the risks?
Oh, that we don't want to be any part of this if this was the result of, the wind and the fog and a risky helicopter ride. I mean, in other words, the tensions are so high that we need to de-escalate. There are going to be rumors about how this happened, and the United States cannot be seen as saying the wrong thing at all engaged. I will say, so they're monitoring it. I know the EU and other entities have been helping with surveillance for the Iranians to try to find the helicopter, the news that we just got. And the third, and I think most important thing, at least at this stage, is to remain quiet so that whatever is going to unfold can be de-escalated. It is interesting to me, and I'd be curious, Jonathan, that the Iranians have really sort of leaned forward on the fog and the weather, that there's not a lot of sort of state-sponsored conspiracy theories about what this is, and that strikes me as good for the overall tensions in the area.
And John, I mean, all day, over the, last 10 hours or so, Iran's supreme leader has asked the country to pray while also saying there will be no interruption in government business. So speak to the cultural significance of saying those things.
Well, I mean, the reality is that the president of Iran has much less power than the supreme leader. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is 85, really has all the coercive elements of the state under his control. Raisi serves him, as does the foreign minister who's also on the plane, Hossein Amir Abdullahian. What I think is really significant here is that first you have a very unpopular government. The last I heard from a Western ambassador in Iran is maybe 10% of the population supports the government. But with Khamenei 85 and reportedly ailing, Raisi was thought as a potential person who power would go to. So he was not powerful but could inherit power. If he's not able to inherit power, you could see some shifts within the Iranian power structure. You could see people trying to move to seize power. I think I agree with Juliet. You don't want to make it seem like this was a U.S. plot, but I think you also, from a U.S. government perspective, have to be aware that this may be a week, 2 weeks, a month, where things are starting to shift and there are opportunities for things to capitalize on changes in Iran that would lead to greater security in Iran and in the region.
And Juliet, you touched on this, you know, the Iranian government, I mean, known for trying to control the messaging. John, I hear you loud and clear when you say, you know, they do have a penchant for kind of secrecy. So I wonder, Juliet, you know, what do you make of how transparent, if we can use that word loosely here, about this incident, you know, the country has been, and will it remain, you know, with this kind of posture of trying to deliver some messaging out front, you know, talking about it could be the weather was bad. How do you see this moving forward?
It's fascinating for the leadership in particular, any Iranian leadership, let alone Middle Eastern, that we're actually following a search and rescue in real time. We are hearing from news sources, state news sources, that there was at least some contact by some survivors. We don't know who they are. There were 2 other helicopters with the one that went down. And so there's at least some knowledge of at least how it went down and how hard. Everyone is going to keep assuming, possibly, at least for the next 12 or 14 hours, that there might be some survivors, and some of them may be the president. If not, then you start a very, very difficult transition. As John was saying, is a very unpopular government that Raisi was under state sanctions, under U.S. sanctions. He's a horrible human being. I mean, people have to remember.
as you have done. But I would like to thank, too, those who have contributed, who would be here, but can no longer be. Too many are
We want to go right to the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard is there. And Vaughn, I take it there have been some changes in the schedule that might indicate some new dimensions that could take place the next day or two. Tell us what you know.
Right, Mika, this is quite the development for Monday morning here. There was a question of whether ultimately we could get a verdict as early as this Thursday before Memorial Day weekend. We expect cross-examination to continue momentarily of Michael Cohen in Lower Manhattan. We expect that cross-examination to take about an hour. And then the redirect from the prosecution of Michael Cohen, we expect that to take about another hour. That would take us to around the lunch break here today. It would then be the defense's opportunity to call their own witnesses forward. They have one individual who they have suggested they may bring forward. They have not ruled out bringing Donald Trump to the stand, though. But this is where the big development just in the last moments inside the courtroom are, because after all the witnesses have been called, that's when you have summations, or you could call it closing arguments. And that could have started as early as tomorrow. But Judge Merchan, inside of this courtroom, announcing that summations, closing arguments in the Donald Trump's first criminal trial will not begin until after Memorial Day, next Tuesday, saying that he was concerned that closing arguments and then the deliberation process for the jury to determine whether Donald Trump is guilty or not, that there could be with that 4-day weekend in hand. There is no court Friday. There's no court Saturday, no court Sunday. Memorial Day is Monday. And so there is concern about having such a long break between closing arguments and jury instructions and the jury charge to the point of the actual deliberation of the jury. So Donald Trump's criminal trial will not be ending this week. It will extend into next week.
Okay, and we've got his morning talk going on there. Let's bring in our legal experts to talk more about this as Vaughn brings us the reporting from the courthouse. NBC News legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Andrew Weissman, MSNBC legal analyst Danny Savalos, and former U.S. attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Joyce Vance also with us. Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker, and White House correspondent for Politico, co-author of the playbook, Eugene Daniels, and of course Politico's Jonathan Lemire is still with us. Let's just go right in line. Andrew Weissman, I'll start with you. Any indication what these changes could mean as well, just upon hearing them?
Well, I think it is very much at face value that Judge Merchan last week had said that he did not want a significant break between the summations of the parties and the actual deliberations. And so by putting this off to start on Tuesday next week, not tomorrow, he avoids that situation because this week they're not sitting on Wednesdays, which is typical. They normally don't sit on Wednesdays, and they weren't sitting on Fridays. It was going to be a significant issue from the judge's perspective. Also, we do have, as Vaughn said, this potential issue of Mr. Costello testifying. That's sort of been floated over the weekend as a possible defense witness. It's quite curious. I'm sure Joyce has a lot to say about that because Mr. Costello has already been the subject of a lot of evidence put in by the state of emails and texts with Mr. Cohen that really suggested that he was acting on behalf of the former president to try and keep Michael Cohen in the fold to prevent him from cooperating. So it'd be very interesting to see if he testifies because, I mean, perhaps the defense would get something, but I suspect the prosecution is more than ready to cross-examine him. So it remains to be seen whether that happens later today.
All right, we'll get to Joyce's opinion in just a moment, but right down the line, Danny Savalos as well, your thoughts. Might we see Trump on the stand? Doubt it, right? Doubt it, right?
Doubt it. Mika, I've been taking the underdog bet, and really for no other reason than if he ended up testifying, I would have been the lone voice to say he was likely to testify, but he's not likely to testify. That was just brazen self-promotion on my part. He's very unlikely to testify. But what I find, what defense attorneys will tell you in these white-collar type cases, you often have defendants who think, gosh, if I could just get in front of the jury, I'll explain everything. This is just a big misunderstanding. And as the trial goes on, they start seeing what it's really like to be in the crucible of cross-examination. And I think it really, truly is a last-minute decision for many defense teams and many defendants who are watching this go on and realizing that if they take the stand, they're creating a lot of risk. But I'll say this. Mika, two things. Number one, I wish more defendants would testify. More and more, I'm starting to think that sometimes defendants can testify and they won't because the second thing I want to say is we defense attorneys are risk averse. We're terrified of being that courthouse tale of the case that they had it won and then the dopey guy called his client to the stand and just destroyed his own case. None of us want to be a cautionary tale, and for that reason, very rarely do we call our clients to the stand. But I've often wondered if that might be at this point more myth, that maybe some defendants could help themselves by testifying. I'm not so sure that Trump is that defendant. And I'm not about to start calling my clients to the stand just because I'd like to see what happens.
Right. No, that probably is not a cool move. So Joyce Vance, I guess right now there's a little sidebar happening and they're discussing with the judge certain emails and evidence that the defense wants to use in its cross of Cohen, which is going to happen today. That's the plan today. This judge seemed to really be moving this along at a tight clip, fair to say. And what are your thoughts on the changing dynamics of the situation?
Right. So I think this new schedule, Mika, represents practical reality. No judge, and Judge Merchan had said he did not want to, wants to permit this big break in time between when the lawyers make their closing arguments and when the jury deliberates. There's just all sort of potential problem. We know how memory fades in that situation. There's an increased risk of outside influence on jurors. So this is a smart move designed to get the case past the holiday weekend, and then it can finish up.
You will get
so Von Hilliard, so there's a bit of a change of plans here. Give us a quick sense as to what you're hearing from our reporters inside the courtroom as to how the first minutes of today's testimony have started, and any other sort of observations or insights you're gleaning as to how the week may unfold.
Oh, what is up, everybody? Hopefully, everybody's having a great time. Now, once again, everybody, do not forget to hit the like on the video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and definitely hit the bell notification. Now, once again, guys, in this video right here, I'm going to show you how to complete her challenge. By the way, I have her in my other account, so I already completed the challenge. I don't have it on this account, but I can tell you exactly what you guys got to do to basically complete it really, really fast. And I'm going to try my best to give you as much information as possible for anybody that seems to be kind of confused in this quest. Now, I'm also going to be giving out this pack to basically 5 lucky winners, okay? I can only give it to you by gift cards. I cannot give it to you by V-Bucks, okay? Because I think I'm assuming that it's cash. Yeah, it is cash. It's like $8.99. So I can only give you $10 gift cards. So I'm going to give it to 5 lucky winners. So if anybody won this, make sure to leave a like. Make sure to subscribe. And make sure you turn on that notification. Like I said, guys, you get this skin right here. You also get this.
Now we've got Senator Bernie Sanders. Thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
You too. We've got the most consequential election of our lifetimes coming up after what was already the most consequential election of our lifetimes in the 2020 election. But President Biden's now contending with waning enthusiasm from young people and progressives as the result of Gaza and Israel, for example. What do you say to those people who right now feel like they want to punish Biden at the ballot box in November by either voting against him or not voting at all?
Well, Brian, that is maybe the most important question that we can discuss. So let me be clear. I strongly disagree with President Biden over his administration's approach to what's going on in Gaza. In my view, and I think that view is shared by a strong majority of the American people, especially young people, often young people of color, the reality is that while Israel has every right in the world to respond militarily to the terrorist attack by Hamas, they do not have the right to go to war against the entire Palestinian people. And that is precisely what we are seeing right now. I think as we speak, close to 35,000 Palestinians have been killed. Over 77,000 have been wounded. That is more than 5% of the entire population. Infrastructure destroyed, education destroyed, healthcare system destroyed. And right now, we're looking at the possibility of hundreds of thousands of children starving. So I think the president is dead wrong on that issue. And I did my best to make sure, and will continue to do my best to make sure, that Israel does not get U.S. military aid to continue that war. Having said that, I would hope that people, in response to your question, take a deep breath and say, okay, what are our options here? We disagree with Biden on Gaza. We're going to look at Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump is a pathological liar. Donald Trump is a guy who does not believe that women have a right to control their own bodies. He is somebody who thinks that climate change is a hoax, somebody who has said incredibly bigoted and racist remarks, who wants to give massive tax breaks to billionaires, who wants to throw millions of people off of healthcare. That is not an alternative. What is the alternative? The alternative is to continue to elect progressives to the House and occasionally to the Senate, build a political movement which demands that Biden starts addressing the needs of working people, the environment, and changes his views on foreign policy.
To that point, can you speak about the ability to move Biden versus the ability to move Trump for some folks?
Look, I think both Trump and Biden are good politicians. That's all. And you're in a political moment. They listen to people. If you think that Biden's people are not concerned with the numbers that they are seeing where young people who used to be supportive of a Democratic nominee are increasingly less supportive. If you think they're not paying attention to that, you'd be dead wrong. So I think we've got to continue the pressure. And in my view, the pressure right now is to say to President Biden, okay, you won your vote to get more military aid to Israel, but you don't have to release that until Israel does A, B, C, and D. And that is, most importantly, end this humanitarian disaster, which could lead to the starvation of huge numbers of people.
Now, to a similar point, we've got an economy right now with some really strong indicators. Inflation is down from where it was. Real wages are up. Employment's at under 4% for the longest stretch in half a century. Stock market's at an all-time high, record job growth. But for a lot of people in this country, they're not feeling its effects. And while inflation is down, for example, prices are still up generally. So how do you approach this issue for folks who simply enough say, I'm paying more at the grocery store. This cereal was cheaper when Donald Trump was in office?
The economy today is stronger than it was when Trump was in office for all of the reasons that you gave. You know, we take it for granted. In my state of Vermont right now, you know what our major economic crisis is right now? It is a labor shortage.
Good problem to have.
Yeah, well, it's not. I mean, it really is impacting our economy. We don't have enough workers. And that is true in many parts of the country. But that is a much better problem to have than to have millions of people who want to work and unable to find jobs. What we have, I think what people are dealing with, and you know, Brian, there are a lot of, you know, people's attitudes are shaped by a lot of things. They are shaped by the pain that we went through with COVID. They're shaped by the fears that we have with regard to climate change. What kind of planet will we have for our kids and our grandchildren? They're shaped by racism and bigotry. They're shaped by a lot of things. And I think right now, when people are looking at the economy, what they are perceiving, I think correctly, is, yeah, the economy maybe, it's okay, but it's doing really well for the people on top. And that is a point that we don't make often enough. In fact, the 1% in America, the billionaire class, have never, ever had it so good. Not in the history of this country. More income and wealth inequality than we have ever had. 3 people owning more wealth than the bottom half of American society. Richest people getting much richer. So I think what the president has got to talk about is say, all right, look, we made some progress on the economy. We're rebuilding our infrastructure. That's good. Making some progress, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, an issue I've worked on. That's good. We are forgiving, by the way, a lot of student debt. I don't know if you're aware of it, but we're talking about millions of young people whose lives have been transformed. I talked to a woman, I was at Morgan State a couple of weeks ago, and she was faculty member, $80,000 in debt, removed, transformative for her life. All right, and that is true I talk to people in Vermont, same thing. We got to talk about that. But most importantly, we have got to demand that the president come up with an agenda that takes on powerful special interests, income and wealth inequality. And by the way, I don't know if you've had the occasion to talk to Lena Khan from the FTC. Have you had that occasion?
No, I haven't spoken to her.
It's a worthwhile discussion. She is doing a tremendous job. Best FTC chair we have ever had in breaking up monopolies and standing up for working people. So we have made some progress, but I do understand the reality that today, real inflation accounted for dollars are no better than they were 50 years ago, despite all of the increase in productivity that we've seen.
Now, another issue that really has impacted people across this country is obviously the issue of abortion. In a recent interview with Time, Donald Trump came out and expressed support for allowing states to monitor women's pregnancies so that they can know if they've gotten an abortion after a ban was put in place. Can I get your reaction to that?
I mean, what can I say? I mean, you know, what can you say? Monitoring women's pregnancies in the land of the free. I mean, it is, you know, unspeakable. And, you know, clearly what Trump and many of his Republican colleagues are about are at war with women's rights, trying to roll back the gains that women have struggled for so many years. But the idea that after women had won the constitutional right, what we thought was the constitutional right, to be able to control their own bodies, you got a Supreme Court undermining, overturning Roe v. Wade, and you got states all over this country, in my view, just humiliating women by taking away basic rights. So, when we talk about one of the issues of this campaign, let's be clear. Biden has been very strong on trying to protect a woman's right to control her own body. And Trump and the Republicans have been absolutely disastrous. And I would hope people perceive and understand that as we go into the election.
I think what's especially crazy, too, is that they're making this decision on the heels of, 10, 15 years ago, fear-mongering about death panels in response to the ACA. And they said you couldn't possibly allow government to get between a woman and her doctor because they'll decide, who lives or dies. And now you have government in between a woman and her doctor deciding who can get life-saving medical treatment and who can't, just because, theocrats want to kind of impose their religious will onto people who don't want it.
I mean, that's absolutely right. And above and beyond that, look, it is not Donald Trump's decision or some, politician's decision to determine what is best for a woman and her family. That's a decision between her and a doctor, in my view, end of discussion.
Trump does seem to get away with being a moderate on this issue, or perceived as being a moderate on this issue, because of his background as this New York playboy who probably himself paid for abortions. Despite his support of the most draconian abortion bans in the history of this country, what do you say to people who give him a pass or write off his extremism on this issue?
What I say is that Donald Trump has boasted about appointing the 3 Supreme Court justices who helped overturn Roe v. Wade and set back women's rights in the most significant way that we have seen in modern history. So anybody, who believes anything that Trump says, I would question anything he says, but B, clearly, this is a man who boasts about overturning Roe v. Wade.
Similarly, he skates by on the issue of earned benefits, despite the fact that when he was president, his own budgets literally cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. What would happen to those programs that Americans have paid into for their entire lives if Trump again takes office?
Well, it's not just him. It is his Republican colleagues here in the House and the Senate. What they are floating are a number of ideas to cut benefits. And their argument is that the Social Security Trust Fund faces insolvency. Well, there is a way to deal with it, which is the proper way. Right now is, I'm sure you know, Brian, if you make 160, more or less, I think $165,000 a year, okay?
You're capped.
And I make $16 million a year. Guess what? We both pay the same amount of money into the Social Security Trust Fund. That's absurd. So at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, the tax system that funds Social Security is totally regressive. You lift that cap, you can expand the benefits that many seniors get. A lot of seniors in this country are struggling, trying to get by on $15,000, $30,000 a year, which is really hard. But if you lift that cap, you can extend the solvency of Social Security for 75 years, and the overwhelming majority of the American people will not pay a nickel more in taxes. That's what we got to do.
On the issue of seniors, just as a quick aside, there's a guy named Eric Hovde,